Welcome. I'm so glad you're here at Calm Lullabies. Before we begin, I'd like to let you know that there are only a few ads in the first 15 minutes, after which you'll enjoy a peaceful, uninterrupted experience. I hope you'll give this video a chance because I truly believe the stories here are unique and belong in your quiet moments before bedtime. If you feel comfortable, a like or a subscription would mean a lot to me, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I offer. Let me know in the comments which country you're listening from and what time it is where you are. I love the feeling that we're all coming together from all over the world in this peaceful moment. And now, let's begin our night together. The girl's thumbs up was wrong. Russell Pritchard noticed it before he noticed her face. She was holding him at a 45-degree angle, not the standard 90-degree angle that commuters had learned out of necessity. 23 years of hauling ill-fated passengers had taught him to read body language before faces, and that thumbs up signaled someone who didn't need the trip so desperately to act appropriately. Nevertheless, he drove the Peterbilt under his shoulder, gravel slapping against its undercarriage. The Nevada sun was where he wanted it, 3 hours from sunset, giving him just the right amount of daylight to drive to mile 108. The air brake squealed. Through the passenger mirror, he watched her approach. In her early 20s, dark hair reached her shoulders, and sneakers were worn enough to bear a date. She moved without the urgency of someone who'd been waiting too long. She moved like someone who was keeping an appointment. "Reno," she said as she climbed into the truck. Not a question, a fact. Russell nodded, already taking notes. No visible punctures, no tattoos on her forearms, her fingernails clean, the surrounding skin intact. These details would matter later when he'd need to describe her to himself in terms of before and after. The door slammed shut. She hadn't rushed to buckle up. Another mistake. Everyone else had, survivors and survivors alike. He pulled back onto Highway 80, the roar of the diesel engine filling the silence she hadn't bothered to fill. Russell preferred the quiet for the first 30 miles. It gave him time to build up his usual physique, establish himself as the improved person he was, ask simple questions, and offer water from the radiator behind his seat. The water was always bottled, sealed, and as natural as it looked. He didn't need chemicals for what was to come. What was to come required only patience and that stretch of highway where the cell phone signal died and God forgot to finish the scene. At mile 17, she turned in her seat to face him. The movement was so sudden that his right hand slid to the gear shift, not because of any threat from her, but because of the element of surprise. For 23 years, they had usually spent the first hour looking ahead. She told him about Tucson, August 14th, 1994. Circle K station on Aviation Highway. She described his 35-minute visit with the precision of someone who had been watching. A pack of cigarettes, a Coke. She knew Christine Valdez by name, and she knew the daisy tattoo on her left ankle, the one Russell had noticed when Christine bent down to tie her shoelace in the parking lot. The air conditioning was set to 20 degrees Celsius, as usual, but Russell could feel sweat trickling slowly down his spine. Christine Valdez. He hadn't thought about that name in years. He kept names in a specific mental box, only opening it when certain moments demanded it. He remembered the daisy, a small thing, yellow petals set against the bony prominence she had as she walked. She had told him she wasn't a police officer before he accused her of being one. She described Christine's fingernails digging into his jeans and the skin of his left forearm, deep enough to leave marks. How he'd worn long sleeves for 2 weeks, even though it was 42 degrees Celsius. She couldn't see his left arm from where she was standing, but the faint white line was there, exactly where she'd said it would be. He told people it was a barbed wire fence. People believe what comforts them. The radio made a clicking noise. Russell reached for it. But the static increased, becoming something that made his hand freeze halfway to the dial. His voice was thin through the speaker, repeating words he'd said to himself in this very car. Words about Christine Valdez, about finishing what needed finishing. He switched off. The silence that followed was worse. The girl recited his tool list without looking at it. A 14-inch ball-headed hammer, bought at the Home Depot in Flagstaff in 1992. She knew how many times he'd used it. She'd miscounted it once. She said 14 when the actual number was 15. But the fact that she was counting all of that meant something he couldn't quite grasp as he tried to keep the truck between the white lines. The mile marker 73 appeared and disappeared. 35 miles to 108. 35 miles to where the road climbs and descends into a valley beyond the reach of cell towers where the highway patrol chain shifts. He had learned these details the way a surgeon learns anatomy, through study, repetition, and the absolute necessity of mastering them. She reviewed his history with surgical precision. Katie Brennan of Lincoln, Nebraska, March 1999. A student at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln studying elementary education. The girl described how Katie's voice rose when she understood, and how it reminded him of a clarinet being played incorrectly. These were thoughts Russell had never spoken aloud, thoughts that had lived only in his private solitude. The truck hit a pothole, and Russell's jaw snapped shut with enough force to break his filling. The steering wheel shook in his hands. Something under the hood was making a sound that hadn't been there. When he started driving, a rhythmic clacking like a playing card between bicycle wires. She told him that he hadn't used the hammer on Katie, but his hands. He convinced himself that it was more private that way, more honest. That word, honesty, the word he used in his own classification of methods. Russell took his eyes off the road, just long enough to look directly at her. She was smiling. It wasn't the predatory smile he'd learned to conjure when it served his purposes, but a more tender one. The smile of someone who'd found what he was looking for, right where he expected it. His right hand slid across the space between them. He'd practiced this move in restrooms during his nighttime drives when insomnia afforded him a few hours of free time. The strike was precise. He pressed against her temple at a slight, downward angle to disrupt the neural pathways that regulate consciousness. She was supposed to slump against the door, her body going limp as bodies do when the brain stops sending signals. She blinked. That was it. Russell struck again, this time with the heel of his palm on the same target. The blow made a sound like a hammer on plywood. She felt a tingling sensation where he'd hit her. She turned her head to face forward, reaching up to touch the spot as if checking for rain. She noticed that mile 108 was 17 miles away, and he was leading her there. He should have pulled the truck over, parked it on the side of the road, and handled the situation properly in the sunny Nevada afternoon when visibility was good and his options were open. But instead, he increased speed. The speedometer climbed past 75 miles per hour toward 80. The rattling under the hood intensified. The truck bed was now rattling, a sound like the cargo straps coming undone. But he hadn't secured any cargo on this trip. He never had when he had passengers. The temperature gauge was rising. Russell watched it move from the green zone to the yellow zone. He'd maintained this truck for 13 years, changing the oil every 3,000 miles, keeping the coolant clean and the straps tight. The gauge had never left the green zone. She talked about his selection process, how he always chose it in the afternoon between 2 and 4 p.m., how he convinced himself it was due to traffic patterns and the fact that few people traveled on desert roads during the peak of the daytime heat. Then she told him the truth and the meaning of light, how he wanted to see their faces clearly when they understood, how He wanted them to see his. Mile 91, 17 miles. The distance he'd traveled hundreds of times. He could drive with his eyes closed. He could tell directions by the positions of shadows and the feel of the road beneath his tires. The truck was pulling him now, resisting his attempts to correct his course, as if something below was holding him back. Russell reached behind the passenger seat. The toolbox was in its place, just as it had been for 13 years. The elastic cord was still taut on its lid. He didn't look at the girl as he opened it. He didn't need to see her face to know where the temple was, where the bone was thin enough. The weight of the hammer was familiar in his hand. A 14-inch oak handle smoothed from his palm. Clearing his throat, a steel head he'd cleaned 15 times with brake cleaner and rags. 14, she said. She'd miscounted. He swung the hammer in a tight arc designed for the narrow space of the truck's cab. The girl's head was supposed to snap to one side with the force of the impact, her body propelled with the force toward the passenger door. But instead, she caught his wrist mid-swing, her grip incredibly strong for her size. The hammer stopped 15 centimeters from her skull, frozen in place as if someone had paused to film. She described to him what was happening inside him, how this was the part he was enjoying, the resistance, the struggle, how his breathing was changing, how he was beginning to feel the thing he had been searching for all day. She released his wrist. Russell pulled his arm back, and the hammer struck the driver's side window with enough force to crack the glass. The truck swerved. He tried too hard to right it, the tires scraping against the gravel on the shoulder before he could bring it back onto the pavement. Mile 95, 13 miles. The engine was overheating. Russell could feel it through the steering wheel, the heat radiating through the metal and composites to his hands. The temperature gauge was in the red zone now. He pressed the needle against the right side of its rim, but he couldn't stop. Not here. Not with 9 miles to go to 108. Not that it mattered. She was sitting beside him, breathing steadily as his breath became shallow and rapid. Jennifer Park, Seattle, December 2001. The girl recounted details Russell had never shared with anyone before. How Jennifer played the violin. How he felt something when he pressed his thumbs against her throat. Not exactly a sound, but a vibration. The residue of a body trained to hold tension in specific ways. She knew he'd thought about it for months afterward. How he could feel the entirety of human history in the moment he ceased to be human. Russell pressed his foot all the way down the gas pedal. The Peterbilt sped forward, the speedometer exceeding 90 miles per hour. The truck wasn't designed for that speed, especially with the engine burning inside. Black smoke began to billow from under the hood, appearing in the side mirrors as an oily slick against the blue Nevada sky. The steering wheel shook in his hands, the front right tire rattling. He felt the rubber start to separate from the wheel, the distinct vibration that precedes a tire blowout. He'd experienced 2 tire blowouts in his career and learned to sense the warning signs in time to avoid the edge of the road. But this time it was happening faster. The vibration was building toward the catastrophic moment when the rubber and metal ceased to be a single wheel and became 2 separate pieces traveling at 90 miles per hour. The girl was looking at the mile marker 108, now visible on the horizon. She described his method with pinpoint accuracy. How he reversed the truck, used the winch, and pushed it into the gap between the concrete and the drain pipe. How spring rain sometimes drove it deep into the channel. He'd read about how pieces of the truck sometimes fell onto the highway. Remains had been found, but they were unrecognizable because the desert had done its work. The marker was 200 yards away. Russell slammed hard on the brake pedal. The truck's response was off. The pedal nearly hit the floor before the brakes engaged. Even then, The pressure was weak and inconsistent. He tapped it intermittently, the way he learned in driver training 30 years earlier. The truck slowed, but not enough. Not with the backing of 18 tons. He drove the Peterbilt to the side of the road, the engine screaming like it was dying. The temperature gauge was in such a deep red that he thought the needle might melt. The truck stopped. Russell sat with both hands on the wheel, breathing through his nose the way he'd trained himself to do when situations demanded clear thinking. The girl opened the passenger door and stepped out onto the gravel. She walked to the front of the truck and stood there under his headlights, even though it was still afternoon and the lights were off. She was looking at him through the windshield, that same gentle smile on her face. Russell reached for the doorknob. His hand returned steady. He had found in his mind that place of stillness, that calm center that had sustained him through 17 critical situations. 15, he thought. 15 situations. She had miscalculated, which meant she had been guessing, which meant she could be dealt with like everything else when the situation demanded it. He stepped out of the cabin, the hammer still in his right hand. The girl stood 20 feet away, perfectly centered on mile 108. This was a mistake. The marker was supposed to be the finish line, the place where things ended, not where they stood and waited. But he had learned to adapt. Adapting was surviving. The first blow had struck her sternum. He could feel her ribs bend under the impact and hear the air escaping her lungs. She had fallen back onto the gravel, her arms outstretched. Russell scanned the road in both directions, clear as usual at this hour, at this mile marker where highway patrols obscured coverage and cell towers created an almost isolated zone of disappearance. He dragged her into the canal by her ankles. Her boots left parallel tracks in the dirt. He would pull her body further into the canal, using cargo straps to hold her down so that a casual observer on the road wouldn't notice anything unusual. By tomorrow, the ants will begin their work. By next week, the small mammals will join them. By next month, nothing will be recognizable but bones, and bones in the desert are as common as stones. Russell placed the body in the drainage ditch, its head slumped downwards inside the pipe. He went back to the truck to get the straps, 3 industrial-grade straps, each capable of holding 2,000 pounds. When he returned, they were gone. He stood where her body had been, looking at the depression in the dirt. The outline of her spine was still visible, a depression that ran from where her shoulders had been to where her hips had pressed against the ground, but the body was gone. Russell walked around the perimeter of the drainage ditch and checked inside the pipe, finding only darkness and the smell of stagnant water. He climbed onto the road and scanned both directions. The Nevada desert offered no hiding places near the highway. Anyone attempting to escape would be visible for miles in either direction. The truck's engine was still running slowly as it cooled down. Russell returned to the cab, tossed the seat belts into passenger seat, and sped off again on the highway. The steering wheel felt loose now, with a void that hadn't existed an hour before. But the truck moved forward when he pressed the accelerator. That was enough. He would drive to Reno, find a mechanic who wouldn't ask questions, and check out the systems. Everything had a logical explanation. Bodies didn't disappear. Girls didn't survive hammer blows to the sternum. His mind was playing tricks on him because of the pressure, because of the unexpected, because even the most meticulously designed systems could sometimes encounter variables that required recalibration. He had covered 19 miles. Mile 127 appeared in his headlights. The sun had set as he dealt with the situation at mile 108. On the side of the road ahead, illuminated by Peterbilt's high beams, stood a girl pointing her thumb at a 45-degree angle. Russell slammed his foot on the brake pedal, just enough to lock the wheels. The truck skidded, swerved across both lanes before its power faded, and it came to a stop at an angle in the roadway. He sat in sudden silence, staring through the windshield at the figure standing on the side of the road. The same dark hair, the same walking boots, the same posture, her weight on one hip, her head tilted slightly as she watched his truck. But this wasn't possible. His mind was collapsing under the pressure, conjuring images of memory, guilt, and the tension of unforeseen complications. He put the truck in drive and sped past her. Without stopping, he glanced in the rearview mirror and saw her standing there, her thumb still outstretched, her smile clear even from this distance in the red glow of his taillights. She hadn't turned to watch him leave, just stood there, waiting. Mile 132. The engine temperature was rising again, faster this time, the gauge going from yellow to red in 2 miles. The clicking sound under the hood was louder now, accompanied by the grinding noise of the transmission, the metal-on-metal friction. Russell pulled over. He got out and opened the hood. Steam rose into the night air, carrying with it the smell of boiling coolant and burning oil. He'd been servicing this truck regularly, changing all the fluids on schedule and replacing parts before they broke down. This couldn't possibly be happening. He checked the radiator because the coolant was out, the oil reservoir was empty, and then he checked the transmission. The fluid level was normal, but the smell was strange, a burning smell. The engine itself was making noises no engine should be making, banging and rattling as if someone had poured gravel into the cylinders. Behind him, the rattling of gravel could be heard. Russell turned around, hammer in hand. Though he didn't remember picking it up from the cab, the girl was standing 15 feet away. The same girl. It had to be the same girl, because no two people share the same features, the same shade of dark hair, the same pattern of wear on their walking boots. She told him they'd been waiting for a long time. She said her name was Rachel. She explained the rotation. Jennifer at mile marker 148. Michelle at 108. 2 sisters taking turns. Russell's hand was shaking as he gripped the hammer. He tensed his elbow, held it firmly in place with his willpower, and told her it wasn't real. Rachel took a step closer. She spoke Meredith's name, their 4th sister. July 17th, 2015. Milestone 108. She was in a car on the way to Reno to surprise her boyfriend. Rachel described how Russell stopped because Meredith seemed like the right fit. Young enough, alone enough, desperate enough. Another step. Russell raised the hammer. Rachel explained what Russell had done wrong. How he'd checked Meredith's pulse in the wrong part of her wrist. How Meredith was alive when he rolled her onto the ferry. How she survived for 3 hours after he drove off, her legs broken, bleeding internally, calling for help that never came. Rachel and her sisters would later piece together the timeline of events. 3 hours of consciousness, 3 hours of understanding exactly what had happened to her. Russell swung the hammer. Rachel didn't try to dodge. The steel head of the hammer struck her just above her ear. The impact was strong enough to jolt his shoulder. She fell to the ground. He stood over her, panting heavily, watching to make sure she was still on the ground. This time, he used the cargo straps immediately, fastening them around her wrists and ankles before dragging her off the side of the road and down into the desert woods. The scenery here was different from Route 108. There was no proper waterway, just barren land and thick undergrowth that smelled of rain even though it hadn't fallen. He left her 20 yards off the road, face down in the dirt, the straps so tight they cut off her circulation. He climbed back into the truck. The engine whirred but wouldn't start. He tried again. The starter kept whirring, the battery losing power with each attempt. On the 5th try, the engine started. It ran erratically, but it ran. Russell didn't wait for it to settle. He got back onto the highway, watching the rearview mirror until the spot where he'd left the body disappeared into the darkness. Mile 148 was 21 miles away. He counted them, focusing on the numbers passing by, clearing his throat on the white line that ran down the middle of the highway, on anything but what he'd seen and what he knew he'd see again, because his mind was falling apart and he needed to hold on long enough to get to Reno. At mile 148, a woman stood on the side of the road. Russell closed his eyes, counted to 5, then opened them. She was still there. He stopped the truck and got out. This time, he didn't use the hammer. He used his hands the way he'd used Katie Brennan, in the way that felt most authentic. He felt her windpipe collapse beneath his thumbs, felt the moment her body stopped resisting and went limp. He dragged her deep into the desert, tied her to a mile marker, and left her there with her head tilted at an angle that meant her vertebrae were no longer properly aligned. He got back into the truck, and the engine started on the first try, as if it had decided to cooperate. The temperature gauge was normal, the transmission was smooth, everything worked as designed. Russell drove on. He didn't look at the passing mile markers. He didn't think about the 3 bodies behind him. He focused on the white line, on the darkness ahead, on reaching Reno, where there were lights, people, and a rational world that operated according to rules he understood. At mile marker 171, she was standing under a street lamp that shouldn't have been there. There are no street lamps on this stretch of the motorway. Russell knew that. He'd driven it enough times to know the lighting conditions. But there she was, lit up like an actress on a stage, her thumb extended at the wrong angle. He didn't stop. He sped past her, watching her in the rearview mirror as she raised her hand in a wave. It wasn't a threatening gesture, just a wave, like greeting an old friend. The radio started working again. Russell hadn't turned it on. He hadn't touched the remote since kilometer 73, when he'd heard his voice coming from the speaker. But now it was jumbled, almost garbled, morphing into sounds about checking pulses and respiration, and 3 hours of calls that no one had heard. He ripped the radio from its mount and hurled it against the passenger door with enough force to shatter its casing. The sounds continued, now coming from somewhere inside the dashboard, behind the climate controls, under the seat, from everywhere and nowhere. Kilometer 184. The steering wheel was hot under his hands, the plastic beginning to soften. The temperature gauge reached the red zone, so high that the needle turned to point toward the sea again. It was as if the heat had transformed into a new kind of cold. Russell's hands blistered where they had gripped the wheel. He could smell his own skin burning, that distinctive smell of pork left too long in the pan. But he couldn't let go. If he let go, the truck would veer off the road, and he'd be stuck here in the desert with the girls perched on shoulders, waiting for him with unwavering patience. The windshield shattered. A single line ran from the bottom center to the top right corner, branching out into a spiderweb-like pattern matching the window he'd hammered. Through the broken glass, Russell could see something approaching in the distance. Lights, vehicles, civilization, or the hallucination of civilization. His mind constructed what it needed to see to keep functioning. At mile marker 198, he saw all 3 of them standing together on the side of the road, arms linked, watching his truck approach. Identical faces, identical smiles, identical thumbs angled wrong. Russell pulled the handlebars to the right. The truck swerved off the highway at 70 miles per hour, the suspension compressed hard as it hit the shoulder, the tires sinking into the soft sand. The world swayed around him. Russell had time to process what was happening. The laws of physics applied to an 18-ton vehicle attempting a rapid change of direction before the truck overturned. The cab spun. Anything not secured became a projectile. The toolbox slammed into Russell's ribs, and the hammer slammed into his shoulder. Glass from the windshield shattered in his face. Small cuts wouldn't kill him, but they would leave a lasting scar. The radio, already broken, had its cord wrapped around his neck like a living creature. The truck completed 2 full rotations before the laws of physics decided it was over. Russell lay in the overturned cab, the seatbelt holding him suspended, blood trickling into his eyes from the cuts on his scalp. The engine finally fell silent, its mechanical screech subsiding. In the ensuing silence, he could hear his own breathing. Quick, shallow, the breath of prey who knew they were trapped. Footsteps on broken glass. 3 groups approaching from different directions. Russell tried to unbuckle his seatbelt, but his hands wouldn't respond. The blisters burst, skin stuck to the plastic, and nerves jumbled between hot and cold. He hung upside down as footsteps drew closer. They first appeared in his peripheral vision, then moved into his direct line of sight. 3 identical faces stared back at him through the shattered windshield. Behind them, the Nevada sky began to break. Dawn was coming, which meant he had been driving all night. Hours felt like minutes, or minutes felt like hours. Time stopped following the rules somewhere at mile 108. The girls pulled him from the wreckage. Russell tried to resist, but his body stopped responding to commands. They dragged him across the desert floor, creosote bushes snagging his clothes, and gravel chafed the burns on his hands. It left a trail of blood that looked black in the pre-dawn light. They stopped at mile 108. Russell couldn't see the marker itself, but he knew where they were. He could feel it in the specific configuration of the scene, in the curve of the highway, and in the location of the drainage ditch. This was the center of his territory, the place where 15 women's lives had ended. The girls pulled cargo belts from somewhere, his own belt stained with 15 different blood types. They worked with efficiency and perfect coordination, as if they had rehearsed this moment many times. They tied him to the kilometer marker, his arms above his head, his wrists crossed, the belt so tight his fingers went numb instantly. They left his legs untied, but broken, using the same hammer he'd used on Meredith to ensure he couldn't escape. One of them leaned close to his face. Rachel. He thought it was Rachel. Her breath was warm against his ear as she spoke of their sister's death in August, of the 9.5 years it had taken to find him. 9.5 years of tracing routes, learning patterns, waiting for the right mix of time, place, and opportunity. They had learned patience from him, she said, learned how to plan, learned that some kinds of justice take time, but that didn't diminish its sweetness. They stepped back. Russell watched them walk toward a vehicle he hadn't noticed. It wasn't a car, but a truck that looked like his Peterbilt, only older, and he hadn't realized his truck was gone until he saw it. They'd somehow removed it, towed it away while he was either unconscious or delirious. They'd left him there alone at the milestone where there was nothing but the seatbelts under the morning sun. The truck sped off. Russell hung onto the post, feeling the first rays of sunlight on his face. By noon, it would be over 100 degrees. By 3, it would be 115. He knew those numbers. He'd planned his schedule around them for years. He understood that the desert heat was both a weapon and a cover, turning bodies into unsolvable criminal mysteries. His throat was already dry. Russell tried to call out, but his voice came out hoarse, barely reaching beyond his shoulder. No one traveled this road in broad daylight. He knew it, he relied on it, and he'd used that knowledge to choose this particular deserted spot as his base of operations. Something stirred in the corner of his eye. Russell turned his head. A jolt ran down his spine, and he saw the vultures circling early. They would wait. Vultures are patient. He had learned, as the girls had, that patience was a strength in itself. The sun rose higher. Russell's shadow shrank. By the time it had disappeared completely, folded beneath him as if it were nothing, the birds had begun to descend. And that brings us to the end of another night filled with tales from the shadows. To anyone who stuck with me until the very end, thank you so much for sharing this journey into the unknown. Your company makes these dark stories feel a little less lonely, and I'm truly grateful you chose to spend your evening here with me. I hope these tales have given you exactly what you came for. That delicious blend of fear and fascination. There's something wonderfully eerie about how we can all gather in the darkness, connected by our love of a good scare. And I genuinely hope tonight's stories resonated with you as much as they did with me. I'll be back tomorrow night with more mysteries and chills waiting to unfold. So, I hope you'll join me again. Until then, sleep well, dream peacefully, and don't let tonight's stories follow you into your dreams. Though, if they do, just remember they're only stories after all. Sweet dreams, my friend. See you tomorrow night.